We've all had those lazy Sunday mornings, the kind where time seems to slow down just a bit and everything feels right. You sip your favorite tea while sitting on the porch swing, feeling the cool breeze against your skin, watching the birds chirp and the world go by. It's that perfect moment of peace, where the usual worries and to-do lists seem miles away. But sometimes in a single, unexpected moment, everything changes, and the quiet life you once knew is turned upside down. That's exactly how my Sunday went. One moment, I was savoring my lemon ginger tea, and the next, my life was no longer my own. It was a typical summer Sunday in Willow Creek Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood where the most excitement came from kids riding their bikes or a neighbor trimming their hedges. Mark, my husband, and I were enjoying a relaxing morning. I was sitting on our porch swing, sipping my tea, while Mark lazily read the newspaper. He'd glance up every now and then to watch a squirrel attempt to steal food from our bird feeder. It was all so peaceful. Then suddenly, a black van without any license plates screeched to a halt right in front of our house. The tires squealed like something straight out of an action movie. Three men dressed in tactical vests and sunglasses jumped out of the van shouting, "HOA compliance enforcement," before charging up our driveway. Before I even had a chance to react, they grabbed me off the porch swing and started dragging me across the lawn. My teacup still clutched in my hand, swinging back and forth, but I didn't spill a drop. Here's the part that caught Mark off guard. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I simply looked at him, calm, unfazed, and gave him a small wink. And that's when it hit him. He had no idea who I really was. We lived in Willow Creek Estates, a place where the rules about landscaping, curb appeal, and community order were taken to a whole new level. The HOA, Homeowners Association, here was run by Karen, a woman whose name was synonymous with control. She was the type of person who fined you $100 for leaving a toy in your yard or ordered you to lower the volume at a BBQ because your laughter was too loud. We always thought of it as just harmless power tripping, annoying but manageable. But Rachel, mostly ignored the HOA's antics. I was calm, grounded, and spent my time gardening, running a yoga class for the neighbors, and fixing anything electronic in under 2 minutes. I didn't let little things bother me, whether it was a power outage, a raccoon trying to steal my sandal, or even being dragged off my porch in broad daylight. The thing is, I had a secret that Mark didn't know. I wasn't just a simple woman with a love for plants and yoga. I was a CIA agent, undercover in this very neighborhood. The HOA. They weren't just the annoying, rule-obsessed busybodies we thought they were. They were connected to something much darker, and I was here to investigate. The second those van doors slammed shut and they sped off, Mark went into panic mode. He immediately called the police. But when he mentioned HOA compliance enforcement, the dispatcher's tone shifted. "Sir," she said carefully, "we've had reports of impersonators operating in your area. Stay put. Help is on the way." Impersonators? What the hell did that mean? Mark didn't know it, but I had already planned for this moment. I had anticipated it. And now everything was about to change, not just for me, but for him as well. After I was taken, the van sped away, leaving Mark standing in our front yard, frozen in confusion and fear. He immediately called the police, but when he mentioned HOA enforcement, the dispatcher's tone shifted. She told him that they had received reports about impersonators operating in the area. She urged him to stay where he was and not to engage. The urgency in her voice only deepened Mark's anxiety. Mark didn't know what to do. I knew what he must have been thinking. He was terrified. The woman he loved was being dragged away by men who claimed to be from the HOA, but something felt off. As the van disappeared around the corner, he stood there, helpless, trying to process the situation. But something was nagging at the back of his mind. That wink I gave him before I was taken, it wasn't a sign of fear or panic. It was a signal. I knew exactly what was happening, and now it was his turn to figure it out. I wasn't just a simple yoga instructor or a gardening enthusiast. I had been a CIA agent for years, and my retirement was anything but. Willow Creek Estates was no ordinary suburban neighborhood. It was part of a covert operation. The HOA, led by Karen, was not just an organization obsessed with lawn maintenance and porch decoration. They were deeply involved in money laundering and shady deals, hiding their criminal activities behind their facade of suburban civility. I had been working undercover, embedded in this community for over a year. My job? To uncover the secrets Karen and her cronies were hiding. But the deeper I got into the investigation, the more dangerous things became. I had to keep up the charade, pretending to be just another resident, living a normal life. But all the while I was gathering evidence, tracking financial transactions, and reporting back to the agency. Back at home, Mark was frantic. He couldn't reach me on the phone, straight to voicemail. He texted but got no response. That's when he noticed a blinking notification on our smart home hub. It was a message he'd never seen before, simply reading, "Pine Protocol activated." Mark tapped the notification, and suddenly a hidden panel slid open behind our bookshelf. He jumped back in surprise, his heart racing. Inside the compartment was a steel case, already unlocked. Inside the case was a slim laptop, a small black phone, and a folded envelope with his name written on it in my handwriting. His hands trembled as he opened the letter. It read, "If you're reading this, I've been taken. Don't panic. This is part of the plan. I know this will be a shock, but I work for the CIA, technically retired. Willow Creek Estates is part of an ongoing investigation. The HOA is involved in something much bigger than you can imagine. I'll explain everything soon, but for now, trust no one, especially Karen." Mark's knees went weak. The letter confirmed everything. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he married, wasn't just some calm, gardening, yoga-loving housewife. She was an undercover CIA agent. And the HOA? It wasn't just an annoying neighbor association. It was a front for criminal activity. As Mark processed the shock of what he was reading, the laptop powered on. It booted straight into a secure CIA portal. No password required. The screen opened up to a file labeled Operation HOA. Mark clicked through the documents. Surveillance footage, maps of the neighborhood, red pins marking various locations, dossiers on all the HOA board members, with Karen's file the thickest. It was filled with pages of financial transactions, travel records to suspicious locations, and one particularly troubling invoice that showed a payment made to a private enforcement contractor. That had to be the fake officers who had taken me. As he clicked through the files, Mark's heart pounded faster. The HOA wasn't just a group of overzealous suburbanites. They were part of a mercenary security group based in Nevada, running illegal operations disguised as a community service organization. In a daze, Mark continued scrolling through the files until a second document popped up. It was titled Contingency Plan Suburban Lockdown. The screen displayed a live satellite feed of the neighborhood. He could see the black van turning down a wooded access road behind the clubhouse. This was bad, very bad. Mark's hands shook as he grabbed the black phone that had been left for him. The screen displayed a number, the one I'd instructed him to call in case anything went wrong. He dialed it immediately. The phone rang once, then a voice answered. "Mr. Granger?" "Yes, who is this?" Mark stammered. "This is Mallory. I'm with your wife's unit. She's safe for now. We've been tracking her. We'll send help." Mark's mind raced. What the hell is going on? Why is the HOA kidnapping people? "Karen isn't who she says she is," Mallory replied, her voice serious. "She's under deep surveillance for laundering money through suburban developments. She might even be connected to a foreign influence ring. Your wife volunteered to go undercover here. The whole community is a front." Mark's stomach dropped. His life had just been flipped upside down. His wife wasn't just a CIA agent, she was running the investigation, and now his peaceful suburban life had become the center of an international conspiracy. "Stay where you are," Mallory instructed. "Backup is on the way, and whatever you do, don't let anyone from the HOA near your house." Just as Mark hung up, he turned around, and there she was, Karen, standing in his front yard with her trademark shark-like smile, holding a thick HOA binder like it was the Constitution, and behind her, the two fake officers. It was clear. The war had just begun. Mark stood in his living room, staring out the window, heart racing. Karen and her fake officers had just left, their fake smiles hiding the true danger lurking beneath the surface. He had no idea what to do next, but one thing was certain. His quiet life in Willow Creek Estates was over. He quickly locked all the doors and closed the blinds, his mind spinning with the new information. I had left him a roadmap, but he still didn't understand everything. As he paced back and forth, he kept replaying the events in his mind. I had winked at him. That meant something. But what? Then the phone buzzed in his pocket. A new message from Mallory. Help is in the neighborhood. Don't engage unless forced. Look for signs they're watching too. Mark didn't waste a second. He grabbed his jacket, ready to do whatever it took to get me back. But as he stepped outside, he saw something that made his stomach drop. Across the street, Mrs. Jensen, the older woman who lived 2 doors down, was watering her plants. It looked like a normal, suburban activity, but there was something off about it. She was watering the same bush over and over again. Mark's eyes narrowed. This wasn't gardening. She was signaling him. He waved cautiously, and she returned the gesture with a quick hand movement before turning back inside her house. Something was happening here. Something bigger than he could have ever imagined. Later that night, under the cover of darkness, Mark made his way to Mrs. Jensen's house. He approached cautiously, wondering what he was getting himself into. As soon as he reached the front steps, the door opened, and Mrs. Jensen, who Mark now knew as Shrubbery, gestured for him to come inside. "Get in," she whispered. "They're sweeping the neighborhood. 10 minutes." Mark stepped inside her home, and what he saw took him by surprise. It looked like an ordinary living room, but there were floor-to-ceiling screens showing live feeds of the entire block. On the desk were encrypted radios, and in a drawer labeled Operation Suburbia Phase 2 was a file he wasn't sure he wanted to see. "This is my team," Shrubbery said, her voice low. "I'm part of Liv's unit. We've been tracking the HOA and their operations for months, and now it's your turn." Mark blinked, still processing what she was saying. "What do you mean, my turn?" "You're the wild card," Shrubbery explained. "Liv's been undercover here for a year, gathering intel. But when they took her, we activated the failsafe. You were the only one she trusted to stay unpredictable. We need chaos to cover her extraction. You're going to help us." Mark was stunned. His quiet, suburban life had just turned into a covert operation, but now there was no turning back. He had to help, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. Shrubbery handed him a flash drive. "This contains a deactivation virus. You need to plug it into the security grid at the clubhouse. It's hidden in the shed behind it. But be careful. The HOA's goons hang out there, and they're not just pretending to be security." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of the task ahead. He had no idea how he was going to pull this off, but he knew one thing for sure. I was counting on him. As he left Shrubbery's house, he felt a strange combination of fear and determination. He was about to infiltrate the HOA's strongest hold, the clubhouse, and disable their security system. But more than that, he was taking the first step in uncovering a web of lies that stretched much farther than he ever could have imagined. Mark walked out into the night, his heart racing as he made his way to the shed behind the HOA clubhouse. The streets were quiet, the kind of eerie silence that you only find in a neighborhood where no one knows what's really going on. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing on him. He was no longer just a regular guy living in a peaceful suburban community. He was now part of something much larger, something dangerous. The shed loomed ahead, the place where the HOA's enforcers gathered. It was hidden behind a row of overgrown bushes, its dull exterior blending in with the rest of the backyard. Mark could see the faint glow of lights from inside, the faint murmur of voices filtering through the walls. The guards were inside, probably having their nightly break. Mark didn't know how much time he had, but he knew it wasn't much. He crouched behind a bush and watched them through the windows. 2 men sat at a makeshift table, playing cards and talking in low voices. They didn't seem to be paying much attention, but Mark knew better than to take chances. This wasn't just a simple task. These were the men who had taken me, who were part of the mercenary group working under the guise of HOA officers. He took a deep breath, wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans, and moved silently to the door. It was locked, but not for long. Liv had taught him how to pick locks, a skill that seemed trivial at the time, but was now a lifesaver. He had one shot at this. If they heard him or caught him, the whole plan would fall apart. His hands trembled as he slid the thin metal tool into the lock and twisted. It clicked open. Mark stepped inside, the stale air of the shed hitting him in the face. He could see the security grid panel near the back wall, hidden beneath a dusty tarp. This was it, the moment that could change everything. Mark was about to plug in the flash drive when he heard footsteps approaching. His heart skipped a beat. He glanced over his shoulder and saw one of the guards coming toward the shed, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Mark panicked for a split second, but then the training kicked in. He ducked behind an old lawnmower, holding his breath, praying the guard wouldn't see him. The man's footsteps grew louder, and Mark could hear his voice muttering to himself. The flashlight swept across the shed's interior, and for a brief moment, it landed on Mark's hiding spot. Time seemed to slow down. But then, the guard passed right by. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He waited for what felt like an eternity, making sure the guard didn't double back, before he moved toward the security panel. With shaky hands, he plugged the flash drive into the panel's port. The light on the device flickered for a moment, and then it turned green. A soft beep echoed through the shed, and the security system went down. Mark's heart raced. He had done it. He had disabled the HOA's surveillance grid. But he knew this was only the beginning. The hard part was still ahead. Getting to me, extracting me, and getting out without being caught. As soon as the system went down, Mark sent a quick message to Shrubbery, letting her know the grid was disabled. He didn't know how much time they had before the HOA realized something was wrong, but he knew they couldn't waste any more. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed. It was Mallory. "Good work. Liv's team is ready. We're breaching from below. Meet us at the clubhouse. Make sure Karen doesn't get away." Mark nodded to himself, even though no one was there to see him. The mission was on, and there was no turning back now. He slipped out of the shed and moved quickly toward the clubhouse, staying low to avoid detection. As he neared the building, he could hear the faint sound of a meeting taking place inside. It was probably just another one of Karen's phony HOA gatherings. But this time, Mark knew the stakes were much higher. The neighborhood wasn't just a peaceful suburban paradise. It was a front for something much darker. Mark approached the back entrance and waited for his signal. His pulse quickened as he heard the faint click of a door unlocking from the inside. The extraction team was here. This was it. The clubhouse loomed ahead, a seemingly harmless building with its pastel walls and inviting porch. Mark could feel his pulse quickening as he approached the back entrance, knowing that the stakes had never been higher. Karen and her team of mercenaries were inside, running their operation under the guise of a community meeting. But Mark wasn't fooled anymore. This wasn't about HOA fines or landscaping regulations. This was about a criminal empire hiding in plain sight. He waited, crouched behind a set of bushes, listening for any sounds. His eyes scanned the darkened windows of the clubhouse, the soft glow of indoor lights casting long shadows across the lawn. He was ready. He had completed his part. He had disabled the security grid. Now it was time for the CIA team to move in. Just then, the back door creaked open slightly, and Mark caught the glint of Mallory's face in the dim light. She nodded to him. It was time. Mark slipped inside, staying as quiet as possible. The hallway was eerily quiet, and he could hear faint voices coming from the meeting room at the far end of the hall. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. Every step he took felt like it could be his last, but he pushed the thought aside. There was no time to hesitate now. He moved swiftly through the darkened hallway, making his way toward the meeting room where Karen and her enforcers were gathered. Mallory and her team were already inside, preparing to breach the room from below, while Mark would create a diversion. His job wasn't just to assist with the extraction, it was to keep Karen from escaping. Mark reached the door to the meeting room. He could hear Karen's voice, sharp and commanding, talking about the latest community improvements and the so-called budget issues that had been plaguing the neighborhood. But Mark knew better. He knew that the budget was a cover for something much darker. He glanced down at the microphone hidden inside his jacket. The team had planted a sound system that would amplify Karen's voice, broadcasting her entire confession to the neighborhood. Mark needed to stall for just a little while longer, buying Mallory's team the time they needed to get to Liv. Mark took a deep breath, ready to make his move. He pushed the door open slightly, just enough to peek inside. He could see Karen standing at the front of the room, flipping through papers in her usual authoritative way. Two of her men, disguised as HOA minutes takers, were sitting at a table in the corner, while the rest of the room was filled with unsuspecting neighbors, looking completely unaware of what was really going on. He took one last look at the small hidden mic in his hand, then stepped into the room, letting the door swing open behind him. "Excuse me, Karen," Mark called, his voice filled with feigned curiosity. "I've been wondering about a particular line item in the clubhouse budget. There's a $14,000 charge for advanced noise management equipment. Care to explain that one?" Karen's head snapped up. The room went silent, and all eyes turned toward Mark. Her expression faltered for a split second before she quickly masked it with a cold smile. "That's for community concert support," Karen lied smoothly. But Mark wasn't buying it. "Right," Mark replied, raising an eyebrow. "And what about the basement? What's down there?" Karen's smile faltered again, this time just a little more noticeably. She quickly regained her composure, but Mark saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. "It's just the storm shelter," Karen said, her voice steely. "I'm sure you have no interest in that." But Mark knew better. The storm shelter was a cover, a place where they were hiding something much more sinister. Just as Mark was about to press her further, there was a sudden loud buzzing sound. The whole building seemed to shake for a moment as the lights flickered. Karen's eyes widened in alarm, and she glanced quickly at one of her enforcers, who jumped to his feet. "That's not supposed to happen," one of the men muttered under his breath, his hand moving toward his sidearm. "Meeting's adjourned," Karen snapped, trying to regain control, but the panic was already starting to show. She knew the game was up. Mark stepped in front of the door, blocking her path. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice calm, but his eyes locked on hers. "Not before we talk about your little money laundering operation, Karen?" Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable. She knew he had caught on, and she was starting to panic. The two enforcers reached for their guns, but before they could draw them, Mark heard the sound of Mallory's team moving in from below. In one fluid motion, Mallory and the team breached the room from the trapdoor beneath the stage. Liv, covered in dirt and clearly exhausted from her time underground, emerged from the shadows, baton in hand. Her eyes locked onto Karen's. "Did you miss me?" Liv said coolly, voice steady despite the chaos around them. Without hesitation, Liv's stun baton crackled with electricity as she lunged at Karen. The mercenary guards attempted to stop her, but they were quickly neutralized by Mallory's team. In less than a minute, the once commanding Karen was subdued, her arms twisted behind her back as she fell to the floor. "You should have stuck to fines for flower beds," Liv said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as Karen struggled beneath her. As Karen was escorted out, the rest of the HOA mercenaries surrendered. Within moments, the building was swarming with federal agents, disguised as local landscapers, securing the area and collecting evidence. The neighborhood was waking up to the truth, but they didn't know the whole story. Mark stood at the front of the clubhouse watching the agents at work. His heart was still pounding, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a strange sense of relief. The battle had been won, and I was safe. With Karen arrested and the neighborhood in turmoil, it was clear that things needed to change. Mark and I had talked long into the night about our future, about what it meant to live in a world where secrets were the norm, not the exception. I knew that I couldn't go back to the life I had before. The CIA had already made it clear that my work wasn't done. There were still many chapters to this story, and my involvement was far from over. But for Mark, the decision was harder. He hadn't signed up for any of this. His life had been turned upside down, and the man he once was, the simple, quiet husband, was gone. The life we'd shared before seemed like a distant memory. We both knew that our future would look different, but there was still a spark of hope. We could rebuild. We could choose how to move forward. I stood up from the porch swing and walked over to the garden, my hands trailing along the leaves of the tomato plants I had nurtured. The plants were growing strong, just like the bond between Mark and me. Despite everything we had been through, we were still here, together. And that meant something. "You know," Mark said, joining me in the garden, "I never thought I'd be here, but I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure it out, Rachel. Together." I smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. The past few days had been full of chaos, but in this moment, with Mark by my side and the future uncertain but promising, I realized we had made it through the storm. The neighborhood had changed, but so had we. As we stood together in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I knew that we had entered a new chapter in our lives. We had faced the truth. No more secrets. No more lies. And though the road ahead might be uncertain, we were ready for whatever came next. The neighborhood had been shaken to its core, but we had survived, and now we were more than ready to rebuild. With the mission complete and the future still unknown, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The world around us had been turned upside down, but together we would find our way back. We had each other, and that was all we needed to face the future. And as I sat back on the porch swing, Mark beside me, the last rays of the sun slipping beneath the horizon, I realized that this wasn't the end of our story. It was just the beginning. The morning after the storm had settled, everything seemed to return to an eerie sense of normalcy in Willow Creek Estates. The neighborhood looked the same. Lawns trimmed to perfection, flowers blooming in carefully manicured beds, and the usual hum of suburban life going about its business. But behind the peaceful facade, Mark and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The past few days had been a blur, racing from one heart-stopping moment to the next. But here we were, sitting on our porch swing once more, the sunlight filtering through the trees, birds chirping as if nothing had happened. And yet, the weight of everything was still heavy on our shoulders. I looked over at Mark, my husband, and for the first time I saw him not as the man who simply took care of the garden or picked up groceries, but as someone who had been thrust into a world he didn't understand. A world of secrets, danger, and covert operations. He wasn't just a civilian anymore. He was a key part of something much bigger than either of us could have imagined. "You okay?" I asked, my voice soft. Mark nodded, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He wasn't just tired from the physical ordeal of the past few days. He was processing the same realization I had. Our quiet suburban life was now a distant memory. Our once innocent neighborhood was a place where spies, mercenaries, and criminal organizations operated right under our noses. And the very people we had called neighbors were a part of that hidden world. "Yeah, just trying to make sense of everything," Mark replied, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "I never imagined anything like this. The HOA, it was all a cover. We've been living right in the middle of it." I smiled faintly, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. "Yeah, I guess I didn't exactly tell you everything, but now you know. And you were amazing, Mark. You've done more than I could have ever asked." Mark chuckled, though it was more of a tired sigh than genuine amusement. "Amazing? I just followed orders." "Don't sell yourself short," I said, squeezing his hand. "You were the wild card. Without you, I don't know how we would have gotten through it." He gave me a crooked smile, still processing the enormity of the mission we had just completed. "I didn't know what I was walking into, but I had to do it. For you." Meanwhile, the rest of Willow Creek Estates was adjusting to the fallout. News of the HOA's true nature had already begun to spread. Residents were talking in hushed voices, some in disbelief, others in anger. They couldn't quite comprehend what had happened, but they were beginning to piece things together. The official story was that Karen and her mercenaries were part of a large-scale money laundering operation. The neighborhood had unknowingly been a front for a network that stretched far beyond the city limits. Karen was being processed, and the FBI had started making arrests, seizing properties, and digging deeper into the HOA's financial records. The once pristine community was now under a microscope. But what the residents didn't know was that it wasn't just an arrest operation. This was part of a larger covert operation, one that had been orchestrated from the shadows by a team of CIA agents, including me. The other members of my unit, Shrubbery and Mallory, had been instrumental in bringing down the operation. We had worked together for months, planting seeds of doubt, gathering intel, and preparing for the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. The operation wasn't over. There were still loose ends to tie up, people to arrest, and investigations to continue. But for now, the immediate threat had been neutralized. The days following the takedown of Karen and the rest of the HOA's mercenaries were a strange mixture of normalcy and chaos. On the surface, life in Willow Creek Estates seemed to return to some semblance of order. The residents, while still processing the enormity of the revelations, began to settle into their new reality. The FBI continued to investigate the money laundering operation, and the local authorities were cracking down on the remaining criminals who had been using the neighborhood as a front. But beneath it all, something didn't sit right. The days following the takedown of Karen and the rest of the HOA's mercenaries were a strange mixture of normalcy and chaos. On the surface, life in Willow Creek Estates seemed to return to some semblance of order. The residents, while still processing the enormity of the revelations, began to settle into their new reality. The FBI continued to investigate the money laundering operation, and the local authorities were cracking down on the remaining criminals who had been using the neighborhood as a front. But beneath it all, something didn't sit right. Mark and I had hoped that once the immediate danger was over, we could return to a peaceful life. We both yearned for a sense of normalcy, something we could hold on to in the wake of the storm. But the truth was, the world we had known had been shattered. We were no longer just a couple living in a suburban neighborhood. We had crossed into a world of shadows, secrets, and espionage, and there was no going back. It didn't take long for the signs of that new reality to start creeping in. One afternoon, as Mark and I were sitting on the porch, sipping our coffee, a moving truck rolled into the cul-de-sac. It stopped in front of the house 2 doors down, the house that had been mysteriously vacant ever since Karen's deputy had disappeared. We had thought it was strange when no one had moved in after the previous occupants had left, but now it seemed the reason was becoming clear. A tall woman stepped out of the truck. She was dressed in black boots, a trench coat, and mirrored aviators. She surveyed the neighborhood with an almost predatory look, her eyes scanning every detail of the street, as if she were looking for something, or someone. Mark and I exchanged uneasy glances. Something about her presence felt off. "Do you think she's part of the operation?" Mark asked quietly, his voice laced with suspicion. "I don't know," I replied, narrowing my eyes at the woman. "But we need to keep an eye on her." The woman turned and gave the mover some instructions in a language neither Mark nor I recognized. It was clear she wasn't just another suburban newcomer. As the days passed, Mark and I began to piece together the significance of her arrival. I had spent years as an undercover agent, and something about the woman's demeanor told me she wasn't just a regular resident. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the thought lingered in my mind. What if Karen's downfall was only the beginning? What if the HOA's operation had deeper connections? And what if the person moving in was sent to clean up the mess, or worse, continue the work that had been started? That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The neighborhood, once so familiar and comforting, now felt like a surveillance state. Mark had noticed it too. People seemed more cautious, more alert. Even the children playing in the streets looked over their shoulders as they rode their bikes, as if they could sense the shift in the air. I decided to visit Mrs. Jensen, Shrubbery, the next day. She had been a huge help during the operation, and if anyone could provide insight into the woman's arrival, it would be her. I made my way to her house, careful to keep a low profile. When I arrived, Shrubbery was waiting for me, her usual calm demeanor replaced with something more serious. "She's from Belarus," Shrubbery said, handing me a file. "Her name's Elena Orlov. I don't know much about her yet, but she's definitely connected to a network of operatives we've been tracking." I flipped through the file quickly, the pieces falling into place. Elena Orlov wasn't just a new neighbor. She was likely an agent sent to clean up the mess left by Karen and her team. The fact that she was using the HOA as a cover meant that the operation was far from over. In fact, it might have been more extensive than we had originally thought. "This doesn't look good," I muttered, my mind racing with possibilities. "How long until we can move on her?" "I don't know," Shrubbery replied, a note of concern in her voice. "But we need to be careful. If she's really part of the same network, she'll be watching us closely." Mark and I sat down later that night to discuss the new development. The peaceful life we had hoped for seemed farther out of reach with each passing day. Elena's arrival wasn't just a reminder that the neighborhood had been a front for international crime. It was a sign that the people behind the operation weren't finished yet. "What now?" Mark asked, rubbing his face with his hands. "We can't just sit back and let this happen. No, we can't, I said, my voice steady but tinged with the weight of what was to come. We need to keep our eyes open. We need to gather information and figure out what she's here to do. We're not going to let them take over again, Mark said firmly. We'll stop them, just like we did with Karen. I looked at Mark, his determination lighting a fire inside me. He was right. We couldn't let our guard down. The fight wasn't over. The next phase of this mission wasn't just about saving the neighborhood. It was about protecting the people we cared about and making sure that the shadows that had once claimed our community didn't creep back in. As we sat together, looking out at the quiet suburban street, I knew we were in for another battle, but this time we wouldn't be caught off guard. We would be ready. The fight for Willow Creek Estates was far from over. The arrival of Elena Orlov had changed everything in Willow Creek Estates. The quiet neighborhood that had once been a peaceful oasis now felt like a battlefield. Every sound, every movement was filled with suspicion. The people who had once been neighbors were now under surveillance, by each other, by the growing shadows of foreign operatives, and by the ghosts of the past. Mark and I had no illusions about our situation. The community wasn't just a quiet suburb anymore. It was a hotbed of covert operations. The HOA had always been the front for something larger, but now it seemed that the organization behind it all had sent in a new player, someone with the skills and connections to clean up Karen's mess, or worse, to rebuild it. Elena's presence only confirmed our worst fears. She wasn't just a new neighbor. She was a key piece in a larger game that had yet to be fully revealed. And we couldn't afford to let our guard down, not for a second. The first thing we did was observe. We knew we couldn't just rush in without more information. Elena was playing the role of the friendly new neighbor, blending in with the rest of the residents. She made polite small talk with everyone, but I could tell from the way she moved, calm, calculated, that she was watching us all the time. I wasn't sure what she was waiting for, but I knew it wouldn't be long before she made her move. Mark, always the more cautious one, suggested we lay low for a while. If we start acting suspicious, she'll notice. We need to stay under the radar, act normal. I agreed, but deep down, I knew normal was a luxury we could no longer afford. We were walking on a tightrope, and every step had to be measured. So we continued with our usual routines. I tended to my garden, Mark worked on a few projects around the house, and we tried to keep up appearances. But beneath it all, the tension was growing. I spent hours researching Elena, trying to dig up any information I could. Mallory, who had become one of my most trusted allies, sent over files on Orlov. She was linked to multiple foreign intelligence agencies and had a history of working undercover in high-stakes environments. Her background was too clean, too precise. It screamed professional. She wasn't here by accident. She had a mission, and we needed to find out what it was before it was too late. One thing was certain: if we didn't act quickly, Willow Creek Estates would soon be under the control of forces far more dangerous than any HOA board member could ever be. One evening, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't sit back and wait any longer. I knew where Elena had gone after the movers had left, and I had a feeling it wasn't just to unpack. As I left the house, I noticed Mark watching me from the window. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was worried. I knew he didn't want me to do this alone, but I also knew that sometimes in our line of work, doing what needed to be done meant taking risks. I slipped out into the shadows of the neighborhood, my eyes scanning the street for any sign of movement. It was late, but the moonlight illuminated the quiet houses and trees. I moved quickly and silently, making my way to Elena's house. The lights were on inside, but there were no signs of life on the street. I crept around the side of her house and peeked through a small gap in the curtains. What I saw confirmed my suspicions. Elena was sitting at a desk, poring over documents, blueprints, financial statements, and what looked like detailed maps of the neighborhood. She was planning something. But what? I had just made up my mind to gather more information when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. There, standing in the shadows, was none other than Shrubbery. "Didn't think you'd be here," I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. "Neither did I," she replied, her voice low. "But I had a feeling you'd be making a move tonight. Thought I'd tag along." We didn't have time to waste. "I've seen enough," I said, motioning toward Elena's house. She's planning something. We need to find out what it is, and fast. We had no choice but to follow her. This was no longer just about protecting our home. It was about protecting the future of everyone living in Willow Creek Estates. We followed Elena, keeping a safe distance as she drove out of the neighborhood. She didn't take the main roads. She took back streets and hidden paths as if trying to avoid detection. We stayed close, but the further we got from home, the more the unease settled in. Something big was coming, and we were about to be in the middle of it. As we approached the outskirts of town, Elena pulled into an old abandoned warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. She parked the car and disappeared inside. Mark and I shared a glance. "This is it," I whispered. "We go in now." We approached cautiously, our steps silent against the gravel. The warehouse loomed ahead, a shadow of its former self, its windows shattered and its doors rusted. But inside, that was where the answers lay. The air was thick with tension as Mark and I stood outside the dilapidated warehouse, its rusted metal doors looming ahead like the mouth of a predator. We had no idea what awaited us inside, but one thing was clear: this was the end game. We had followed Elena for miles, weaving through dark alleys and deserted streets, until she had finally led us to this forsaken place at the edge of town. The abandoned warehouse seemed quiet, desolate, but it was the perfect cover for whatever operation she was running now. "Ready?" Mark whispered, his voice steady despite the anxiety that gripped him. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We had made it this far. There was no turning back now. The moment we stepped inside the warehouse, the world seemed to change. The air was cold and musty, the only sound our footsteps echoing off the empty walls. We could see the faint glow of lights in the distance, just beyond the stacks of old crates and rusted machinery. But there was no sign of Elena, at least not yet. We moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows as we advanced toward the source of the light. The smell of dust and mildew filled the air, and the farther we walked, the more the oppressive atmosphere weighed on us. We both knew that the true scale of what had been happening in Willow Creek Estates was about to be revealed. And the more we uncovered, the more we realized how deeply entangled the neighborhood had become in something far darker than we had ever imagined. Suddenly, a door at the far end of the warehouse creaked open, and Elena stepped into view. She was no longer the calm, polite neighbor we had seen in the community. Now she looked like the professional she truly was, cold, calculating, and in control. "Well, well," she said, her voice smooth as silk, but with an edge of threat. "I was wondering when you two would show up. It was only a matter of time." Mark and I stayed silent, watching her carefully. We knew that any wrong move could be our last. Elena wasn't just a spy. She was a force to be reckoned with, and we were in her domain now. "You've been a thorn in my side for far too long," Elena continued, her eyes flickering between the two of us. "But now, it's time to end this." She motioned to the back of the warehouse, where two other figures appeared. We hadn't seen them before, but the look on their faces told us everything we needed to know. They were here to finish the job. Without warning, Elena reached for something at her belt, a small device that began to glow ominously in her hand. "I'd offer you a way out, but there's no time for that anymore." Mark took a step forward, his body tense and ready. "Not today." Before Elena could activate the device, Mark lunged, taking the first strike. The fight that ensued was fast, fierce, and brutal. The two men with Elena charged toward us, but we were ready. Together, we fought as one, using every skill and ounce of strength we had left to stay on top. The fight wasn't just for survival, it was for the future of Willow Creek Estates, for the peace we had once known, and for everything we had fought to protect. After what seemed like an eternity, we finally managed to subdue Elena's allies. But she was still standing, more dangerous than ever. "You think you've won?" Elena sneered, wiping a trickle of blood from her lip. "This isn't over. You've only scratched the surface. There are far more dangerous people than me behind all this, and they won't stop until it's finished." But before she could say another word, I stepped forward, grabbing her wrist and twisting it with precision. "It ends tonight, Elena. Your game is over." With a final sharp movement, we took control, disabling the device she had been so eager to use. And just like that, the warehouse went silent. Elena was captured. The operation was over. The sun rose over Willow Creek Estates the following morning, casting a warm glow across the neighborhood. It was a peaceful morning, at least on the surface. For Mark and me, though, the battle was far from over. Elena was in custody, but the threads of the criminal network still ran deep. We knew there was more to uncover, but for now, we had a moment of peace. As we sat on the porch swing together, watching the birds flutter around the garden, it finally hit me. We had made it. We had survived. And somehow, we had come out on top. "What's next?" Mark asked quietly, his hand resting in mine. I smiled, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. "Next, we rebuild. We protect this place. Together." And with that, we knew that whatever came next, we would face it as a team. And so the journey of Willow Creek Estates comes to a close. For now. But what happens next? Will new threats arise? Will peace last? Or will the shadows that linger pull us back into the fight? If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated with more thrilling adventures, deep mysteries, and exciting twists. This may be the end of this chapter, but the next one is already waiting to unfold. Thank you for following our journey. The story's not over. It's just getting started. Let's see where it takes us next.